please put your hands together and let's welcome Peter Leyden.
Hey, thank you. Wow, thank you very much. What I want to basically do is talk to you on a big picture level, though. I mean, really, the way I like to talk about this is, you know your basic coding. I mean, you're throwing around languages here. But I want to talk about what is going on here in your field, what is going on with technology, and what is going on with other trends related to technology that is really working on almost basically a world historical plane. I mean, there's really a story going on here that people in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and more will look back at what was going on around the time of the beginning of the 21st century. And it is really a story that you are all really a part of and you should really be appreciating. And so I'm going to pull back and take a very big picture kind of perspective on this and actually help kind of breathe life into a lot of those statistics that were kind of flying at us there, all of which are good. I'm going to try to kind of put that in context, explain it in these kind of longer strokes, and get a little better sense of really, really the big story that we are living through in our lives today. Now, one of the ways I think, one of the best ways to understand what's going on is that we are really living through a pretty rare transformation on a global scale right now. I mean, I've actually been doing there's a lot of Europeans here, I've been doing a lot of reading on the Enlightenment from about 1640 to 1715, which is an amazing time in European and world history, when really the foundation for scientific method and all the different kind of basic technologies of the Industrial Revolution were starting to be thought through. It was an incredible time, a time of really massive upheaval and transformation. And it's one that now we look at and we kind of really understand in its distillation what really took place there. We're in that kind of time now. We're really in that kind of time. And we're in a kind of, it's basically a time of really fundamental reworking of all the basic foundations of how the economy works, how the society works, how people communicate, how everything connects up together. And you hear some of that rhetoric around, in these kind of tech conferences. But we should really be thinking deeply about what does that really mean. Now, if you take these moments globally, or if you take them, in our case, in the United States here, there's quite a few Americans here, and I will be, as an American, kind of filtering some of this into how it's actually hitting this country here. But there's really two fundamental things that drives these periods of kind of rapid innovation that happen for about 10, 20 years. The first thing is a society, and let's just use America just as an example, because it's a useful example, you could say, and everyone kind of has at least some basic knowledge of what's happened in this country too. What happens is you get such deep structural changes to the fabric of the economy, the fabric of society, that essentially the old systems for organizing things just don't work. They basically get disrupted in a very fundamental way. So, for example, it's like when you go from an agrarian economy, an economy organized around agriculture, to one organized around industrial production. That's such a fundamental thing that nothing in the old system kind of works in the same way, and you really have to have some kind of burst of really fundamental innovation to figure out how to do that. The other thing that actually drives these changes is essentially unprecedented challenges. It's something appears that your old system has absolutely no way to wrap its head around solving. And so you're forced into kind of really deep and fundamental innovation. Now, this has happened in the case of the United States. So just to kind of put a lens, well, how big a deal is that? It's happened about 4 times in this country. It's happened for those, and again, we're not going to go into total lesson here of history, but there was a period in the very beginning of the 19th century, the Revolution of 1800, which was elected Thomas Jefferson, essentially opened up about a 25-year run of a crazy innovation in politics and in the economy, democratizing the economy happened here, which set up about a 50-year run of how the country worked. Then about mid-century, around the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, everyone kind of associates him with slavery and the Civil War. Really, it actually ushered in a crazy amount of innovation around the fundamentals of the American economy. I mean, we did things like the transcontinental railroads. We basically had this Homestead Act. We were giving away land. We basically had land-grant universities that completely democratized education in a way that had never happened. 25 years of essentially reinventing America that lasted for the second half, 50 years of the 19th century. And right around the turn of the 20th century, there was an explosion of innovation for about 25 years. We call it the Progressive Era. It was both parties. Republicans here is Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson with the great League of Nations, as you guys in Europe kind of know too. There was a crazy period of inventing essentially what it was to be early kind of mass urban industrial society. And ultimately, the last one was around the Great Depression of World War II. Again, these things happen. They carry on these very classic patterns. We're in one of those moments now. That's the way to really understand what is going on in this world right now with all the craziness around us at all times. So what is essentially driving our era? Well, the one is, and you're all part of this, we are watching the most fundamental technology transformation at the very basis of society that you could possibly get. And basically, it distills down to the computerization of everything and the interconnection of everything. That's essentially, when you really distill it, that is about as profound as you can get. That's what's happening. The second thing is that is partly driving, and also some other trends are driving, essentially the globalization of it, the global interconnection of everything. In fact, if people, when I mention that thing 50, 100, 200 years from now, when they look back, they'll say the really most fundamental thing that happened at the beginning of the 21st century was the world went global. And all systems have to essentially rework on that plane. We're just in these early stages of trying to sort that out. How do you organize everything globally? That doesn't mean you're not going to organize things locally, too, and within nation states and things like that for a considerable time here. But essentially, we're opening up a whole new way of having to organize things. And the third thing is we are hitting this level of unprecedented challenges, not the least of which is global climate change. But there's all kinds of things, system breakdowns that are working all over the world. I mean, it's, not just global warming, it's global terrorism. We're trying to figure out the educational systems breaking down, the health systems aren't working here, the retirement systems aren't working out here, Europe, other countries as well. It's essentially a system breakdown, and it's basically driven by this very fundamental upheaval that's happening around us. So whether we like it or not, and I like it, we are living through a really amazing moment of transformation in our country and in the world. It's a time of really fundamental transition. It's going from essentially a world organized by these kind of basic nations to much more interconnected global, not just economy, but ultimately, I think, on a level of society almost, you could think of it. We're also going, a very fundamental thing happening this century is we're shifting from essentially carbon-based energy to essentially clean energy. It's one that essentially is, we're just beginning to go on here, but really, it is going to be one of the most fundamental reworkings of the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Something, again, folks in your capacity should be really tuning into. Even though it's not strictly IT, it is certainly going to have tons of ramifications on information technology. And ultimately, the quick way to think of it is we're basically finally making the transition from a 20th century world that pretty much got sorted out and was working pretty darn well, particularly after World War II, to essentially a 21st century world, which we are just trying to figure out today. So what I'm going to basically do today is try to break that story down into 6 manageable kind of levels. We're going to move through a lot of material here, but I think it's one that you'll actually quite enjoy. One, we're going to go back to some of the basics. And you're all kind of tech savvy here, but I think it's really worth going back to the fundamentals and think, what is really taking place here, and how much room do we have left in this digital revolution? I would say we actually have a lot more room here, essentially, to bring some really unexpected changes. The other thing I'm going to talk about then is I'm particularly looking at new media, and you mentioned some of it here when you set it up here. There's really 3 spaces I want to look ahead on. The mobile space, where it's going, the social space, where it's going, and video, which I think is a much bigger deal than most people wrap their heads around. And we'll talk about that. Another thing when you look into the future is the one key way that you can really, with confidence, kind of look ahead is to think about the fundamental demographics. Once someone's born and once a generation is out, that thing just rolls through the next 80, 100 years. And in fact, there's a lot of ways you can look ahead on what's happening demographically and have a kind of good insight into what's happening, not just in this country, but again, globally. I'm going to shift then quickly. These are all be kind of relatively short things. I want to get into the fundamentals of the economics, talk about some kind of the ramifications of this technology in economics. Ultimately, you mentioned this long boom concept that we had came up with. It's still going strong in many respects. But also the rise of China, talk a little bit about what that is and how that fits in. I do want to bring in this energy thing because I think it's a really fundamental thing. Anybody looking ahead has to kind of start to wrap their head around it. And the final thing I'm going to wrap on is just essentially where this, what I call kind of a problem-solving capacity is essentially going through a big upgrade here. And ultimately, think of it as how collaboration, software, and ways that we can kind of work together with a lot of sophistication, how that's actually improving and hitting a new kind of plane here, which could actually be a save the day in many respects. Anyhow, there's a lot going on here. What I like to do is I'm going to touch on a lot of little facts you may have heard in other contexts, but connect the dots do everything with a little bit of a forward spin to throw it forward, and we'll kind of run through a lot of material here that I hope you'll find will be fun.